Yes. So, fishing summer. Fishing summer is a time frame which lasted between the years of 2020 and 2022, probably. So it's sort of a 2-year period in my life. It's defined by being on board the Seahawk. And so the way that I was originally hired on the Seahawk, I was working at Eagle Crest, our ski area, as a lift operator. And every day there was this guy called Og who would come up. He was a snowboarder. And he was just, one of the regulars, right? And so one day in late in the season, so February, he was like, "Hey, do you have plans for the summer?" And at that time, I did not. I was like, "No, I don't." He was like, "Hey, you seem like a pretty cool guy. What if, imagine this, we worked on a fishing vessel?" I was like, "Oh, that would be funny, ha ha ha." And he had a couple beers in him at that point. He wasn't. It was late in the whatever. But then the next day, because he was a regular, he came in as well. And I was like, "So were you serious?" And he was like, "Yeah. What if?" And so yeah, I talked to Og. Og recommended me to Roger, who's the captain. Roger, we talked once. We had a little interview, I guess, at his house, and he was like, "You seem like a chill guy. Boom, you're in." And so that's how I got on board the Seahawk as a deckhand in the summer of 2021. I'm trying to remember. I showed up at Roger's house. It was out at the end of the road, right? So kind of out in the middle of nowhere. I rolled up and I walked in, and I don't remember if he even asked me any questions. He was like, "Yeah, so you're pretty cool. Og says you're cool, so I believe it." And we chatted about. I don't even he didn't even ask me any questions. I think really he was like, blah 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 blah. And then he gave me his card. I signed some paperwork, and then boom, I was in. I think he made me hamburgers. I don't really remember, honestly. But it was cool. It was pretty laid back. Captain Roger, absolute legend. I loved him. He was 1,000 years old. I don't know. He had been fishing since before I was born in those waters, not with the same boat, but with kind of the same boat. He was the captain. He was blind in one eye, and also he couldn't hear really well, and he had an ulcer. He was, kind of out there, in a lot of ways, but great captain. All things considered, because he was retired, he had been a teacher, right? So he paid us great. But the great thing about Roger was that he always told us no, I don't think I saw him drink anything other than whiskey the whole time I was out there. But he would always mix it with the Cascade ice, you know what I'm talking about? And it looked the same. It was and so I was consistently grabbing for my drink, and it would be Roger's drink, and immediately, because you'd unscrew the top, and you're like, "Oh, fuck, this is not my drink. This does not smell like my drink." Me now, older and wiser, I think he had the right idea, frankly. But, yeah, so Roger was great. I said he was 1,000 years old. He was somewhere in the 60s or 70s, 80s. I don't really know. He had 2 kids who were older than I was, who had kids who were older than I was, so, he was older. And then Og was great. He was, in his, not the summertime, he was a math tutor out of the campus. But he was my other crewmate. He was maybe 30-ish, mid-30s. So at the time, 10, 12 years my senior. He was just I don't know, he was just out there for a good time. He and Roger had been working together for a long time, and I was sort of like a rotating crew of like the third deckhand in air quotes, or the second deckhand, I guess, because Roger was the captain. Um, and yeah, he like knew what he was doing, but also kind of he was chilling, big chilling. Hog was, yeah. Seahawk was the Seahawk was a very interesting, not very interesting, very normal boat, I think. Seahawk, probably a 30-foot, it was a bow picker, gill netter, stainless steel. Old. It had definitely been underwater at least once. But yeah, basically, we'll describe the boat, right? So at the front, you had at the very front was the bunks where Og and I slept. And so, at the prow, it was a V-shaped hold with two benches, and we took Og took one half, I took the other half. That's where we slept. Directly behind that, the cabin, open floor plan, was both the like the kitchen, the dining room, and the cockpit. Was sort of the entire cabin. It was just one big room. And that's where we spent a lot of our time. And then behind that was the holds. I think we had 5 of them for the salmon. And then behind that was the actual net and the picker and whatnot, which is where we did most of the work. So there's a big drum, right? Never been gill netting. There's a big drum at the end with the big net that goes out behind. And you organized job, we would set the net, which means typically he would run the motor and I would sort of spool it through my arms and Roger would drive the boat. So the boat moves, the net goes up behind, and I'm like, making sure it goes out. And then it would sit there for a little while and then we would pick it so it goes back in. And as the salmon come over, we like pop them out because their gills get stuck in the net onto the deck, and we toss them across onto the main deck between the cabin and the spool, and that typically breaks their neck, and then that's sort of how we did the picking. But it was actually I did the sleeping, right? It was generally like whenever we set the net, the way gill netting works, all right, is you can call it, some people call it gill napping, because you set the net and then you probably have a 30 minutes of doing nothing. Your boat just sits there and the salmon hit the net and you're sort of drifting. And so every time we weren't doing something, Og and I would be in the hold, in the prow, sleeping, because we would be working 24 hours. Or sometimes Roger would have Og or I watch the boat, especially when we're on the line. Roger would have Og or I watch the boat, so like steer it and make sure we weren't like running into any rocks while he took a nap in the main area. Og took a nap, or I took a nap down below, and then the third person would make sure the boat was in the right spot. So we did that a lot. I did that a lot actually, because it was easy. So we're driving the boat around, but it was nice. We had a kitchen. We had like a little table. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So I will describe fishing summer to you. So the season is the opening. Fishing, you can only fish for 3 days out of the week. You have an opening, and it's Sunday from noon to Wednesday to noon. It's like 3 days. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, essentially. And so I would get to the boat Saturday night. Every Saturday, I would go bowling. Every Saturday, right? And I would go bowling until midnight. And I would walk to the boat, and I would get on board, and I would fall asleep. And then Og and Roger, because they didn't live downtown, I could walk to the boat. I lived right downtown. I was like 5 minutes away from the docks. Og and Roger would show up, and then they would go out. And so I'd wake up, and it would be noon on Sunday, because I would go to bed there Saturday night. Noon on Sunday, I'd wake up, it would be on the water. And so typically, Roger would look at the tides, because the way gill netting works, if the tides are going in, you want to be on the line, basically. And the line is the legal boundary between where you can fish and where you can't fish. Tides coming in, all the fish from open water are being pulled in towards the shore from across the line, where you can lay your nets in. And so it would be every fishing vessel when the tide was going in would line up at the line, and when it was your turn, you would lay out your net, and you would sort of drift back with the tide for about between 30 minutes and 2 hours till you got down. You would pick the fish and you'd go back to the line, so the tide was still coming in. If the tide was going out, you would be sort of interior, or if the line got really busy, like if you had like a 2-hour wait or whatever reason, because like every boat was on the line, we would go elsewhere and pick and set the net and catch fish that way. But really, it was mostly on that boundary, because on the outside of the boundary, there's no fish being fished, and so all of them are coming in. And again, that would be about a 3-day opening. And so it was, 3 days, you're on the whole time. The whole time you're on. From the minute the opening opens till the minute you're off. So we'd be setting nets morning, noon, night, whenever Roger said it was time to set nets. We would throw it down, drift with the tide. And that was a little unusual. We were a boat that fished in the night. Not a lot of boats did that. And yeah. So and then pretty much, every 30 minutes to 2 hours, Og and I would go out. We would pick the net, so pull all the fish off, throw them in the hold, and then set the net back. So I would spool it back out in wherever it was, and then we would drift again, let the salmon come into the gill nets. And probably once an opening, we would have to unload our holds. And so there are tenders, which are fishing boats that don't fish, but they have big-ass holds, and that's where all of the vessels would go, and they would unload their fish into the tenders, and the tenders would go back to town and offload their fish into the actual fisheries. So we did that probably once an opening, like the halfway point. We would unload and then reload, and then before we left, we'd unload to make sure we came back to port with like a mostly empty hold. And unloading takes about an hour. You go in and they hoist up all of your holds to make sure you're empty, and you can go back out. I don't remember how many pounds of salmon we could hold, but it was quite a few. But the main thing was we would always go out. The opening is 3 days, and we'd always go out with about 4 days worth of food, because week by week the Fish and Game would be monitoring the amount of salmon intake. And sometimes they would open the season longer because there hadn't been as many salmon caught. So sometimes we'd get it extended. You never knew until Wednesday or whether or not it was going to be extended. So we always brought 4 days of food just in case it was extended. But sometimes it would be extended 2 days. And that's when things got we were eating fucking, granola bars. Because, we had our 4 days of food and we were out there for 5 days. So that last day, we were down to our dregs, just kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. And we never super hungry, but it would be we were eating beef jerky the whole time the last day, because it had been, we were planning for 3 days, we had food for 4 days, and it had been extended to 5 days. And that's when things got a little tight. But I always remember the big thing was you can never have any caffeine or anything to keep you going during the season, during when we were opening, because you had to be able to fall asleep immediately. Anything, any kind of coffee, if you're drinking coffee, you had to be able to, at 1:30, pick the fish, sleep for 2 hours, wake up, set the net, pick the fish again, and then go back to bed. And so any kind of caffeine would ruin that sort of schedule. And so I always remember, like, the tradition was when we were driving back to port, after we'd unloaded everything, we would always have a cup of coffee on, like, our last thing. And that was the greatest part of the whole opening, was that cup of coffee going in. Absolutely incredible, because it would have been like 3 or 4 days since you've had your last cup. It was just divine. Absolutely great. Yes. Um, the biggest thing, the big story from my fishing summer was we had been out. It was probably nearing the end of the season, and our boat, the Seahawk, which is the boat I was on, was a little different from the rest of them because we would be not at all of them, but from the majority, because we would fish night or day. Doesn't matter the hour, we were always casting the nets. And so it was kind of stormy out, and it was like, 1 a.m, and we just set our nets. We had just taken our nets up. We were at the line. We were fishing at the line, the tide was coming in. We had just finished picking the nets, and we got 3 salmon or whatever. And we were driving back. And so Og and I are in the back of the boat. We had spooled the net up, and we were dividing the salmon amongst the holds and, identifying and whatnot. And Roger was driving. And again, blind, essentially, old, and it was fucking pitch black out, right? It was stormy. It was the middle of the night, raining sideways. And I just remember sitting at the back and looking up and being like, damn, we're kind of like, I should provide some context. So the area that we were fishing, we're in Southeast Alaska. It's an archipelago. So it's a ton of little canals and fjords between islands. And that's where we're fishing, right? And so the line is also like between islands. It's in this narrow area. We're not in the open ocean. We're between these narrow islands. And so we're in the back, dividing the salmon up after just picking it up. And Roger's driving us back to the line, which is, again, the line is right next to the land. And Og and I look up, and I just remember being like, damn, we're like pretty fucking close to the island. And then the most like horrifying noise I've ever heard, because Roger was driving and he drove us here's the open water, here's the island. We're going like this. We just drive directly onto the beach, a full speed ahead, in the middle of the night, and we're boom, like totally on just the beach, and the tide's coming out, which is why we're fishing on the line, because the tide was like moving out. And so we are just the most beached you can possibly be. Full hold. Like the Seahawk is loaded to the gills on the sandbar. And, there's still some water, but it's going out rapidly. And we have hit run aground. And so Roger's 2 sons are out there. He calls them up. They come out. They throw ropes to us. They try and drag us out. With just their motors, but the problem is the tide is rapidly retreating, and they don't want to get run aground either, so they can't get that close. And also the water underneath the Seahawk is rapidly dropping, so they're unable to pull us off the beach. And so it becomes really clear that we're going to spend the next 8 hours on the shore. Until the tide comes back up and lifts us off the beach, and we can float our way out. So the tide's dropping, and so we're just the boat is balanced, right? And so I just remember as the tide drops, we've got to have there's 5 holds on the Seahawk, 2 on each side and 1 in the middle. And as the water dropped, we would feel the boat shift, because we'd have more salmon and ice and whatnot on one side and the other. And so when it first happened, Og and I were fucking like on that shit. We would run, the tide's dropping, we feel the boat rock because if the boat tips on the side, it's over. We're fucked forever. It's never coming back off. And so we can you can hear it though, like the boat creak and start to tip. And when that first happened, Og and I run over to the hold, take all of the water out and all the salmon and throw it in the other one, equalize it. And so we hear if you ever been on a boat that's beached, there's this horrible noise it makes when it starts to tip. It's crazy. It's the whole world is creaking underneath you. And so that happened once, and we restabilized it, and we had to restabilize it back. And then the tide was out. The boat, no one was coming to save us. We had to just sort of wait the next 8 hours for the tide to go out and then come back up, and we could float back off. And so we would go to bed. It would be okay, the boat is balanced, and we would all go to our positions, Og and I in the prow, and Roger at the captain's seat, and we just sit there, perfectly still. And then after 2 hours, you would hear this creaking sound as the boat, it was even, and it would start to tip. And you could hear everything sliding, and this horrible creaking sound, and Og and I would just come careening out of the prow and throw 3 or 4 salmon to the other side, and the boat would restabilize. And yeah, we did that for about 8 hours. I don't know if anyone actually slept. And we did, it would go one way and then the other. But the tide rose back up, and we floated off the beach, and the Seahawk did not sink. It was not flooded with water. So we survived. And then we kept fishing for 3 or 4 more weeks. So the pay was really nice in all comparisons. It was during the low point of the salmon. Salmon have been in decline for the past decade basically at that point. And we were at one of the worst years ever in air quotes. But I made probably, I think it was 10% of what the boat made went to the deckhands. And so I depending on the week, I made between $500 and $2,000, and I was paid weekly. Roger would give me a check, so it really depended, but it was good money, and all things considered. After 3 days of work, we kind of made bank. He was a good captain. I started in May, middle of May, and it ended at the beginning of August. So it was the whole summer basically. But there was a very distinct number of weeks. I don't remember exactly how many. But it was a 3-month gig. And every week would be different, right? Some weeks we made a lot, we caught a lot of salmon, some weeks we didn't catch any. We kind of ate really well. Roger was, the way it went is, again, we brought 4 days of food, and we would freeze it. We freeze dry it beforehand and put it in a cooler. But we had meals out for about 4 days, and I always brought, everyone else always brought extra food. So we'd always have beef jerky. We'd always have the instant oatmeal. We'd always have, there's one other thing we always had. I don't remember exactly. We never had water. Is the weird thing. We never had bottled waters, but we always had the Cascade ice. That was the one drink we had on board, which was interesting. But Roger made the best goddamn burgers I've ever had. He hand ground them. He was a big hunter, and so it was reindeer and not reindeer, but deer and onions and beef combined. Incredible burgers, or it was lasagna. For the first 3 days, we ate like kings. If the opening was ever extended, things got real tight real fast. So after that 3rd day, we were rationing stuff. We'd have a sandwich, right? We'd have one meal a day, one proper meal a day. But we had we had a kitchen on board. And so we'd always eat burgers was a classic, lasagna was a classic. We'd have chicken pretty regularly. We ate pretty well, all things considered. It for those first for the days that the opening was expected to be, and if it extended, it got rough. We ate it was like, okay, everyone's eating beef jerky the rest of the opening, which was rough. But yeah, it was good. It was good food. Yeah, so the season ended. This is during my gap year, 2020, 2021. The season ended, and I went to college. And I wasn't going to ever be a fisherman, right? And when I was thinking about going back to Juneau, they had opened a new position. JEDC, the Juneau Economic Development Council, had opened a downtown ambassador position, which is sort of like a person interfacing with tourists, right up my alley. Super cool gig. And I didn't love working on Seahawk. Like the pay was good, but the work was shitty. And it sort of consumed my summer in a lot of ways, right? Like I'd be out there for between like 3 to 5 to 4 days. 3 to 5 days and then one of those days I would be spending the whole time like mucking out the boat, doing a lot of maintenance on it. So most of my time was spent out on the water. And the day that I wasn't, I was exhausted or preparing to go back out. So it really, it was very much a full time, like this was what I'm doing. So I wanted to do something different. And also the JDC gig for the Downtown Ambassador was really sick. So the season ended, and when I was coming back to Juneau, instead of continuing on the Seahawk, I did the Downtown Ambassador thing, which I've done for the past 3 years or whatever. And that was great. I loved that job. So, yeah. So we would always empty it all out. Before we went back to port, we would stop by the tender, and so all the salmon were gone. But Roger would always have like a couple of his buddies who had like specially ordered fish. So we'd have what are they? Silvers, that we would save specifically, sockeyes, we would save specifically for people back on port that we'd unload. But sort of the way it is to ready a boat for an opening. An opening is about 3 days. And you got a lot of salmon. And so what you need to do is, number one, clear out the holds. That was my job really was on, the season closed on Wednesday, and on Thursday I'd come in and I would clean out all of the holds. They're big fucking places. Like they are large holds. And so I'd hop down in there and like scrub all the blood off of it, get all of the gunk out, make sure it was spick and span. Just like water and soap and shit. And that would take a couple hours, not a couple hours, but like maybe 2 hours of just like cleaning the decks and scrubbing out all the holds. And then the day before we'd go out, so let's call that Friday, we would load the ice in. And that was a whole process. Like we'd load the ice in and refuel the boat. And so Roger and I would come down, sometimes Roger and Og, sometimes Roger and me, kind of depend on the week. We'd come down, we'd load in the ice, from like a big crane. And so all 5 holds, you would dump the ice in. The way it worked was you would have a big ass, net, I guess is the right word, of ice that you would lower into the holds. And you would load in 100, 200 pounds of ice into each hold. And the fisheries that you were partnered with, the canning industry that you were partnering with, would provide the ice. And then you would go in and load the ice up and then go over to the refueling docks and refuel. The big issue with refueling, I remember this happened twice, is we'd go to refuel, but Juneau weirdly gets a lot of yachts in the summertime. And so we would go to refuel, but there'd be a yacht in it, and the yacht covers the whole refueling dock. So we'd have to wait like an hour for the yacht to refuel, and then we would go refuel. It's a whole thing. And then that was really my part, was like getting the ice, cleaning the holds. Sometimes Og would get the ice, it kind of depended. And then Roger and Og were really in charge of one, like engine maintenance was sometimes a thing, and then really getting the food and the supplies. Roger was in charge of like making sure we had enough food and enough like cascade ices and enough stuff to like do the opening. And we were constantly worried because if our net tore, we would have to like spend time in port repairing it, but we never got a bad net tear the whole season. And so we never had to go in and repair it. But if it had been, that would have been a whole thing. Let me know any more good stories that I've got from. Yeah, I do. So, okay. This isn't a specific story, but this is a thing that happens when you're gill netting that nobody ever told me about. So, the process of picking, the way it works is there's this big spool and the net's on it, and you set it out, and then you let it drift, and when you bring it back in, it brings up a whole bunch of stuff, and it goes in real fast. And so both of the people who are picking the net stand right at the bow of the ship and watch that sort of zoom in. But Alaska has jellyfish, and they get stuck in the net. And as it comes over the side of the boat, the jellyfish are like vaporized. But their toxins are still potent. And so whenever we were going through a jellyfish patch, Og and I would be in the back, and you would get like this mist of jellyfish jelly that would come over the back as the net's going in at like super high speeds and just liquidating all of the jellyfish. And, you're wearing like coveralls and gloves, but your whole face would be covered in jellyfish goo that would like numb everything. And that was just like a thing that happened like once or twice in opening. Like every single week, your entire body would just get covered in jellyfish goo. And before you could like touch other parts, it was like totally fucking numb your face. And before you could touch other parts of your body, you'd have to clean off like this film of gel that had covered your entire front of your body. Because you have to be like ready to catch the fish out at the end of the boat. But you had these jellyfish coming in. It was terrible. It was absolutely awful. But that just happened all the time. It was crazy. And there's nothing you can do about it. And so that's why we always wore hats, to keep the scum off of our faces and our hair. Okay. So that's a classic story. Oh, terrible. So when you're picking, sometimes you get like no fish, right? If like it's a bad opening and there's a lot of sticks in it or whatever, sometimes it's just like the whole time you're just like picking out sticks, picking out non-salmon. But when it's like full, you're getting like hundreds of fish over the end every time. And so the way a gill net works is that the fish swim in and their gills get caught in the net. And so organized job, when we would take the gills and like pull them out of the net, the perfect technique is fish comes in, right? And so the net holds like this, and the fish's head goes right through it. And the gills get caught in the edge. And so you would reach in, you would grab the gills, you would open it up, and the fish falls out. And you would then grab the tail, and you would throw it back onto the main deck from sort of the pit that that you're picking from. And so it would fly like 20 feet, hit the back wall, like, snap the fish's neck. It would just fall on the hole. It would just, And so you would, at the end of like a good picking, the whole deck is covered in fish, all of whom have been thrown across. So they've been bludgeoned. There's blood everywhere. And then you would throw them into the holds. And so you'd have like an average hold. It is taller than I am, right? It was like 6 feet deep and maybe 10 feet long. So I could stand in it. and it's taller than I am. And maybe the bottom like third is filled with ice, but the rest of it would be full of fish. And the interesting thing about it is that when you pull them out of the water and you throw them across the deck, is that they don't die. Like salmon can survive a long time outside of water. And with the ice that we put in the hold, it would melt and it would give them water that they could drink, and breathe out of. And so you'd have these layers of fish, and the top layer and the second layer would always be alive. So you would open one of the holds and you'd have feet worth of salmon all doing the thing where they're gasping for air and their eyes are looking around. But they're not dead. They'd be for the whole opening. They wouldn't be dead when we brought them to the tender. And you would just have, but the ones at the bottom, they wouldn't die from suffocation. You would crush them under the salmon that you put on them. And then you would do that layer after layer and day after day. It was just, I don't know. That's what it fucked me up. I think about that a lot. Because you have a lot of downtime when you're fishing. And there'd just be a bunch of salmon just that are still alive in the holds, just but they can't, they're not getting quite enough air. They're getting enough air to live, but not enough air to really breathe. I don't know. But sometimes they would die. You would throw them across and the whole thing, you would know. They wouldn't be moving anymore. But sometimes most of the time they wouldn't. They'd just be alive but crippled, sort of flopping around. Even when the holds were open, you were moving them across to the tender. I don't know, fucked up. Yeah, so we didn't have a toilet, we had a bucket, and we didn't have you couldn't shit inside. So every time you had to take a proper shit, you had to go onto the back deck and take a bucket and then shit into it. We didn't have toilet paper either. And then hope that nobody around was looking at you because it was a totally open back. Yeah, it was pretty fucked up. The second thing is that Roger once told me a story about when it was misty and one of his deckhands, they were line fishing, and one of his deckhands got caught in the lines and was thrown out to the ocean and died horribly. But they couldn't see him because it was misty out, and so he drowned. So, those are my 2 bits.